It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person was torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day, listeners, and they're off and racing now in the 2022 federal election. Now, the two Jacks, we've got to be open about this. We did have a free swing last week. We went to the Nets, and we had a bit of a run around. We had presumed that Scott Morrison was going to go to the people on the 4th of April, and we decided to get out there early. But of course, he didn't. He didn't go until the 10th of April. That's when he drove to Yarralumla. G'day, Jack from Hong Kong. Hong Kong, Jack. How are you, mate?
G'day, mate. I think we'll just call that a captain's run, won't we?
Yeah, I know, just a hit out in the nets, mate. But I tell you what, I was hitting them right in the middle, and I feel pretty good about it. I feel pretty good about it as we go on for the next 5.5 weeks. A very long campaign. We'll talk about that in a minute. But yes, Scotty did the drive to Yarralumla, and it was added on by the VIP jet landing at Canberra Airport too. So it was a real festival.
It's becoming more and more absurd each time, really, isn't it? You know, I turned on the telly up here in Hong Kong at the ABC, and they had live shots of the plane sitting on the tarmac at Fairbairn there. You know, quite ridiculous.
No, we can't laugh too much, but because we thought he was going to go to Yarralumla on the 3rd, but really, if he didn't go on the 3rd. He had to go this Sunday, so there was no great surprise about any of this.
No.
He really needed to go this week. Look, the first thing...
I'm just thinking next time they'll have a plane trailing the VIP jet, you know, choppers, you know, choppers filming it in the air, you know.
Now, the Prime Minister of the day might have to call in the RAAF over that one, Jack. Get some birds in the air. Look, I did notice too, just as an aside for the conditional release program people, so we've got the Occupy Canberra movement going on there, which is a pretty poor show. It's only a couple of hundred of them, if that, and they all were. Basically, standing as a cortege for the Prime Minister's car to come through. There was some AFP around there to make sure nothing happened. But the Occupy Canberra mob, the cookers we call them, they all said, we predicted this. We predicted that there would be an election call today. And I thought, well, really, that's not great, you know. I mean, I won't get your Melbourne Cup tips just yet, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So we have the timetable.
Occupy Canberra. We had Occupy Hong Kong for about months, but we had about 50,000 of them every day. You know?
This is sad, mate. This is really sad. There's a couple of hundred of them at best, and they're not really occupying it. They're just being nuisances, you know. They have terrible trouble with buses. I won't go on with it, but it's the most pathetic thing you've ever seen. We don't have protests anymore. We have occupations, which is just awful. The timetable. The rolls close on the 18th of April. So if you've moved house there's automatic enrolment now through the AEC. But if you've changed house, changed circumstances, etc., you've got to get it done by the 18th of April.
Yeah, well, I'm actually off the rolls at the moment. I'm sort of looking to see how I can get back on. Right. But that's because I've been out of the country for 12 or 13 years, and somehow the Electoral Commission managed to get me off, and it's pretty tricky to get back on from up here. So
knocked on the door and knocked on the door at your residence and says, "Is there a Hong Kong Jack here?" And the residents at that place said no, and that was it for you, I guess.
Yeah, apparently that's what's happened. Yeah.
Yeah. Nominations for candidates close on the 21st of April. Now that's a bit of an issue, isn't it, Jack? Because
I haven't printed the form off to have a crack yet, you know.
No, well, that's right, and it means a little bit for our markets. But the Libs in New South Wales have got some. Well, it's been largely resolved, but their pre-selections a lot of them are still in the air. The Victorian Labor Senate nominees are still in the air. So they've got to get their work done. Going to have to have a few late nights to get their candidates, and they're the two major parties. And for the raft of independents and single-issue parties, they're going to have to get it all done by the 21st of April.
Indeed.
And when can people drive into the or drive down to the ballot box? Jack, what's the earliest date they can do that?
9th of May, I believe, the pre-poll starts,
9th
which
of May.
sort of indicates that a fair bit of the heavy work of the campaign is going to have to be done before that.
Yeah.
Because particularly in COVID times, I think a lot of people will take advantage of the pre-poll and line up when they...
Well, what we did see I'm not quite sure the South Australian figures, to be honest, but the New South Wales by-election figures were that you had basically 50% of voters pre-polling. So that's a big number, and it does impact on campaigns, of course. So you've got 12 days to get your vote in, including polling day, the 21st of May. Have you had a look at the polls, Jack?
No, I haven't, but I know you have. I had a quick glance this morning, but I know you're all over them.
It's like heroin for us in the commentariat. When the news poll comes out of a Sunday night, the Australian try to keep it very close to their hats. And there's a bloke on Twitter called the Ghost Who Votes who seems to have an in, and every now and then they try and trick him by feeding him some dodgy results and then coming out at about midnight with the actual news poll results. So the news poll will be weekly now, and we'll update you on every week as we go through the podcast and through the campaign. The primary vote was Coalition 36 unchanged, Labor down 1 on 37, Greens 10, fairly consistent that. Not quite sure that that'll be the case when we actually count the votes. Greens 10, others 10, it includes UAP on their primary vote figures, and FON on 3. I just want to do some quick calculations here, Jack. So you've got Coalition 36, Labor 37. That's 73%. Now, in the 2019 election, it was 71. And we can talk about the trend running over a number of decades, going down from, I guess, in 1977, I think it was 92% of people voted for the major parties, and now it's down into the 70s. But my point is, do you think the Coalition and Labor will get more primary vote than they got in 2019? Again, bucking that trend, that slow decline in favour for the major parties. What do you reckon?
I would have said yes, but I think the fly in the ointment with that might be the independents standing against the Liberals, which might just take a percentage or two off that.
Yeah, I guess what we're talking about, 7 seats there, 7 blue ribbons, may not affect the national vote that much. Well, it will split the coalition vote in those 7 seats to give Indies at least sort of, high 10s, maybe into the 20s and maybe more. Look, we do have others, including UAP. On other polls, UAP's running about 2 or 3. So there's a sort of 7 percentile there on that primary vote that we attribute to others. Now, others are, there's a whole raft of single-issue parties, Justice Party, Animal Justice Party, IMOP, which is one of the anti-vax mobs. There's a whole raft of independents that run every time. In fact, at the last election, Jack, others ran, which included UAP, at 10.63 of the primary vote.
They got a little bit more than the Greens last time, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. Looking at that Greens figure, look, they'd be very pleased with that. Put it that way. I don't know that it will be seen in an election. I probably think it'll be closer to 8 or 9, but we'll see.
I think if they got 10%, they'd be doing a lap at the TV room with a vase in their hand.
Yes, I think they'd be very, very pleased.
They'd have thought they won the premiership,
Yes, it would mean a couple of senators, couple of new senators, couple of bright, shiny new Green senators coming our way, I would think. Not quite sure on the state breakdowns there, so we don't know where they would come from. But anyway, on the two-party preferred, Labor leads 53-47. That narrows down from 46 to 54 a week ago. And 55-45 in their favour a fortnight before that. Now, on that 47-53 figure, if that was uniform across the country, it's not going to be, of course, but if it was, that would give Labor a gain on the pendulum of about 10 seats, or gain of exactly 10 seats if it was a uniform swing, and they need net 7 to win power in their own right. So yes, it's certainly Labor are looking reasonably good in that polling. But what I'd say is, if on the basis of that uniform swing, which is, as I say, a little bit tricky, that gain of 10 seats, it means it's going to be really close, doesn't it?
It does. And I mean, one thing is we have to remember, on those figures, you'd kind of expect the government to lose.
Yeah.
But in our lifetime, there have just been 6 opposition leaders who've won government from opposition. 6 opposition leaders who've won elections and gone into government. And that's out of about 20 or 23 elections. So it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah. And it's probably fair to say, too, that through most elections, you've got, in recent times, that you've got the opposition leading the polling as the campaign starts.
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah, I'd want to go back and have a look at that to be sure. It certainly was the case in 2019, where Labor were well in front on that sort of 47, 40, 46, 54, 47, 53 sort of margin at the time. It's narrowing, but that 47, 53 on a uniform swing, which doesn't happen, would give Labor a majority of 4 in the in the new parliament. So not a big, we're not talking landslides here at this stage on that polling. On that polling, some other polling is showing, including the Ipsos poll that I saw most recently, is showing Labor ahead 55-45. Bear in mind they got 48.5 in 2019. So it may be bigger, but on the news poll, it's shown Labor down 37% as primary vote. It needs that primary vote to be 37, 38. If it starts getting into the sort of mid-30s, that's when you can have some bad results. Of course, the coalition of 36, well, they got 41 in 2019. So their vote has come down a lot just on the polling as we start this election campaign.
Yes, well, the way I see it overall is that both results are possible, or all 3 results are possible. A hung parliament, a Labor win, and a Liberal win. I don't think anyone's over the line yet, and that brings us to the campaign. There's a bit to do.
Yeah. I mean, won or lost in the campaign. Just quickly on the betting markets, got Labor fairly firm favourites at $1.30, and I think the coalition at $3.10. On a separate market, the hung parliament is at $3.20. Statistically unlikely. That's what you're getting about the hung parliament. But if you've got a mess of indies who get in, there's currently 3 in the parliament. If you get 5 or 6, then that hung parliament becomes more and more likely.
I think there were 6 independents in the hung parliament. In the Julia Gillard-led election, weren't there?
I guess there was the one from South Australia. They were the sort of Xenophon party group that might have been included in that. But yes, look, the more indies you get, the more crossbenchers you get, the more likely you get to a hung parliament.
And we can talk about this if we get closer to a hung parliament, but the worst mistake I've ever seen a Labor government do was have that wedding breakfast thing with the wattle and the lapels when they married the Greens.
There was a lot that went wrong at that time, and basically it created the preconditions for the 2013 election. Look, we could talk about it all day. I'll just say very quickly, if Labor didn't get into bed with the Greens, they would have had a much easier run. And it's not as if the Greens were going to go anywhere else.
No,
it's not
exactly.
As if they were form a coalition with Tony Abbott.
It was a lack of understanding of the way that the constitutional law works, and it was a huge error in my view, and it just looked terrible.
So we've just very quickly, you've covered the spectrum of what can happen. What do you actually think will happen? And you can have a couple of options. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, who do you think should win?
Who do I think should win? Oh, gee, it's hard to say. I mean, I think the government has been relatively competent, but their politics has been messy all the way through. And the question for the voters, I think, will be, and the one that will be most important to them is, do they think they will continue to be competent or have they kind of run their course? Have they run out of steam and run out of energy and run out of ideas?
I think, excuse me, I think if I, in any way involved in the Labor campaign, I would be drawing the attention of voters to the fact that, and this is very difficult for Labor to accept, but the coalition didn't expect to win in 2019. So they wake up on a Sunday morning and go, oh, gee, hang on, we're still in government. And they really didn't have any ideas on how to go about that. And furthermore, they've left a lot of skeletons lying around, in terms of sports rorts and regional development funding and all these kind of pork barrelling exercises that left them wide open, that showed that actually they were trying to minimise the scale of their loss. They were funding up coalition-held marginals in the view, not that they were going to win them, but they weren't going to hopefully lose them by too much. So we did see a government sort of fall ass backwards into government again, and not with having too many great ideas about what they were going to do about it. If it was on me, I'd be really pressing forward this idea that it is time to refresh government. It is time to get some people in with some energy and enthusiasm. They might not be very much better than the current mob, but the current mob are stale. That's the way I'd be putting it to voters the Labor campaign.
History tells us that the Australian voters change government when they think the other governments either got things dramatically wrong, got something dramatically wrong, like sadly that was the view in 1975 with the Whitlam government, or when they've just run out of power, run out of steam.
Yes, and it doesn't happen very often, so it tends to be 3-4 elections, 3-4 election victories before that happens, what they call the fag end of government, which is you're just about done. Your ashes are in the ashtray, and it's just about time for you to go. And that's where we get this axiom of governments losing elections rather than oppositions winning them. And we would say that of Howard in '96, after a long Paul Keating government, run out of rocket fuel, as Keating once put it. The Rudd-Gillard thing was different. We just talked about some of the distinctions there when they faced a hung parliament. I mean, they got rid of Rudd. You and I disagree on this, but I think what they did in getting rid of Rudd before he was due to be re-elected, and possibly by increasing his majority, was just not understood by voters, and it just looked tricky and awful. And I got rid of a bloke who was popular amongst the electorate.
Yeah, popularity is a funny thing, isn't it? He was very popular amongst the people who got to know him over Sunrise, and very unpopular amongst the people who had to work with him.
Well, yeah, popular among people who didn't know him personally.
Yeah, who hadn't met him.
That's right. Yeah, that's the way it goes. That was the way it was put, actually.
But popularity is a funny thing. I'd say that my guess is that Kim Beazley was more popular than John Howard. He's a likeable kind of fella, amiable, all that sort of stuff. And he had 2 cracks and couldn't win.
Yeah, he's well on his way to a 3rd drubbing in 2004 when they tapped him.
When he got the tap on him, So, yeah.
Well, he was well on his way to perhaps a fourth in 2007 or 2006, and he got the tap on the shoulder, and that was the last one. We won't be coming back to tap you again. You're done.
Yeah. So, the popularity, likability thing, and I've no doubt that Morrison is unpopular and is kind of unlikable to quite a few people. I just don't think it's all that important. I think voters look more at whether they think someone's going to be competent than whether they'd be a nice bloke to have a beer with.
Yeah, look, just briefly with the news poll on those kind of likability factors, Morrison has gone, I think, 3 or 4 points ahead as preferred Prime Minister over Albanese when they were sort of neck and neck last week. But Morrison's approval rating is -12 and Albo's is -2. So neither of them are very popular or likeable, but Morrison is distinctly unlikable with a -12.
Yeah. Well, I don't think anyone thought Bob Menzies was a likeable character.
Well, yeah, you wouldn't, if you were sitting in the Healy stand and you wouldn't want to get in the car, you wouldn't want to get in the Rolls to have a bit of fun. You might just stay in the Healy stand and have a beer and watch the Blues go around that one. Look,
listeners won't know this, but as a Carlton fan, you know this, that after he had his stroke, they had a little special ramp where he could drive the Rolls Royce under the Heatley stand and watch the footy without getting out of the car. It was like he was going to the country footy, and you stay in the car.
The driver didn't honk the horn when Carlton kicked the goal. That was one difference. But he did get out of the car. You'd see the driver, that is, get out of the car and just make sure that any errant balls that were kicked out of bounds in the forward pocket, he'd just knock them out of the way. Didn't damage the rolls.
Yeah, I always wondered whether the bloke with the raffle tickets would come around and tap on the window, because I used to do that at the country footy when I was. By the time I was sort of playing in the seconds, after I had a shower, you grab the raffle book and the bag and head around and knock on the windows of all the cars around the ground and sell them a raffle ticket.
Yeah, don't know if they ever did that. Don't know if they ever tapped on Ming's window and said, hey, give us a couple of bucks. Give us a couple of bucks for the meat tray.
Yeah.
Look, we do have a long campaign. Often 4. We've got one that's nearly 6. In fact, it's 1 day short of 6 weeks. So it's a long campaign. And why do you think Morrison has opted for a long campaign? Bearing in mind just one thing, that between the time an election is called and beforehand, the government can continue very, very expensive advertising that says rah, rah, the government. But that can't happen once the poll has been called. But why do you think he's gone the 6 weeks?
Well, it's hard to be absolutely sure what's in his mind, but I suspect he thinks that the more he exposes his opponent, Anthony Albanese, to public scrutiny, the better.
Yeah.
Mistakes have been made with this. Malcolm Turnbull opted for a very long campaign in 2019. The trouble was
Turnbull, yeah.
Trouble was that Malcolm had no energy and sort of kind of meandered his way through the campaign without really getting any pizzazz about it, and he almost lost.
2016, I think.
2016.
To be fair to Malcolm, it cost him $70 million.
He had to pony up his own money, didn't he?
Had to pay for his own campaign because the Liberal Party was broke. Look, the long campaign does at least offer the possibility of exposing that small target strategy that Albanese is said to have adopted, and certainly it's not a policy-heavy campaign that he's looking at this stage. It really is in that small target area, and the problem that he has with that, and it's sort of not so much that likability factor, but it's just the identification that do voters know enough about him. When they go into the polling booth, they might say, well, we know Scott Morrison's a bastard, but I don't even know what this bloke's about. I don't know what he stands for. I don't know what he's about. And that's the problem. That's the problem with that small target strategy, and it is exacerbated, potentially at least, with a longer campaign.
Can be. Having watched Scott Morrison play the ukulele, my attitude to him is that I think we know too much about Scott Morrison.
too much of the trivia.
Yeah.
You know, knocking up chook runs and
Sri Lankan curries and God knows what.
Yeah. That's embarrassing.
But there is an element to we don't know quite enough about the Labor leader. In fact, I think I was watching The Drum the other night, and a Labor person from Melbourne said, "Well, I don't know much about him, to be quite honest." And I thought, well, that's probably right. About Alba.
Yeah, look, I hate small target strategies because it takes voters for mugs. It makes, yes, it leaves you wide open to attacks from your opponents, but what it actually says is that basically we do not want to have a contest of ideas. We are shirking that because we're a little bit scared that someone will pick holes in our funding or our policies or mock us in some way. And that's a shame, and it can be a great shame because by the time you get in, if you're lucky enough to win power and you get into government and then you introduce a raft of or suite of policies in a particular area, voters are entitled to say, well, you didn't tell us you were going to do this. So that's why I think it's poor. But also, I understand the political imperatives of the small target strategy after 2019. It's just that, that vulnerability exists, that there will not be enough of you well known to voters. And I had a chat with a good mate of mine. He's an elderly fellow. He's a big farmer. He's been involved in business most of his life. And he said to me, well, Bob Morrison's a bastard. In fact, he used a harsher term than that. And I said, well, that means you won't vote for him. He said, I didn't say that. Because I don't really know what the other bloke's about.
Did he confuse him with a regional airline, did he?
Yes, he did. Yes, I think that's the he did. He did use the C word. We might have to use the C word a little bit as we go.
I've got a mate from Sydney who's a lawyer. He used to do a lot of travel around the rural New South Wales, and we're having lunch one Friday over a few drinks, and he was talking about the new regional airline. He just got off one that morning, and he says, look, I've never thought it was a great airline, but I didn't think it was that bad.
See you next Tuesday. Yes, which leads us in an odd kind of way to how this campaign might be run. And I'm told that some of the gallery journalists have put their feet down for what it's worth, and they said, look, we are not going to get involved. We're not going to get on the bus unless you tell us where we're going first. And we're certainly not going to go right around all day with you blokes, whether it's Labor or Liberal, and then at the end of the day get given a press statement and a 2.5 minute crack at a press conference. And it is really no way to cover the election.
I've never understood why, in the early days, they used to send their quite senior people on the bus and the plane. Yeah. And I thought that's just a terrible way to cover the campaign. You might send some junior flack out there to do that, but all it leads to is this absurd gotcha journalism, which doesn't take you anywhere. And I think people just ignore it by and large.
Yeah, well, look, we've had a bit of it already with Morrison being asked about a payment made to the former, what we say, the former mistress of a minister of the Crown. I think a
500K.
Yeah, 500 large, and he was asked about that, and a sort of gotcha moment. I mean, look, he should be asked about it. When he said he didn't know anything about it, and it was kind of where it all fell flat. And then Albanese, this is a classic gotcha, mate. Albo was asked what the unemployment rate was in the country, and he didn't know the answer. Gotcha. I mean, look, that's kind of ridiculous stuff.
I don't think that goes anywhere.
More and more of this stuff. No, I look. It's the old Keating, litre of milk question. I mean, what do you expect? Your Prime Minister, you want to pop down to 7-Eleven and gets you the milk and the bread in the morning. It's not his job to know what the price of a litre of milk is, because John Howard stood up in that debate, and that was a 96 debate, and said he knew it was $1.50 a litre, and as if he was down the shop every week. So unfortunately, our campaigns, the hard hats and Hi-Viz, Jack, they're just going to be filled with a lot of these moments, aren't they?
It will be. I mean, I'm sure Prime Minister Keating would have known the cost of a Mahler CD or the price of a second Empire clock from France, but a litre of milk. No,
he'd know that very well. He'd know that very well, and he'd get a bargain on it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But that's absolutely right. I mean, these sort of silly questions about what's the CPI, what's the unemployment rate, what's the current interest rate, and expect to get a gotcha moment from journos. And look, if the early days of this campaign are anything to go by, we are going to have plenty of this sort of stuff going on. And what we're going to try and do, Jack, is keep away from those gotcha moments, or at least mock them mercilessly. And because I don't think listeners or our listeners or voters generally care much about them.
No, I don't think so either, to be quite honest. Yeah. When they get in the polling booth and lick the end of that little pencil stub, before they make the mark, I don't think they're thinking about whether Albo knew what the unemployment rate was.
No, well, they've just finished the democracy sausage, and they're feeling pretty good about things. They're popping out of the cake stall afterwards. Look, again, we get back to that. Maybe less than half of people will be actually doing that. When they do stick the ton on the pencil, it might not be election day. It might be a week or two beforehand. So that means we're going to have the campaign rev up in the first couple of weeks, and it's going to be a lot of, because of the small target strategy, largely, it's going to get very personal and nasty, wouldn't you say?
Probably will. Yeah.
There's a lot at stake. So the gloves are already off, as far as I can see. So Morrison is going to be running an attack at Albanese all the time, and that is based on this. Hasn't been in government. Well, he has. Has never. I think his attack last week was he's never created a budget. And Morrison said he'd done a couple. Of course, he had. So he's never been treasurer. Inexperienced, that sort of thing. Personal attacks because Albanese is going to try and stick and move around policy every time.
Don't know how far that takes you. I think the best Prime Minister of our lifetime, Bob Hawke, had never made a budget or had an economic portfolio either.
Yeah, look, absolutely right. And that personal attack can really backfire, particularly, if you're just constantly negative and people look at, because people do know a lot about Morrison and they might dislike him, and they said, you actually dislike him a little bit more now. And that may not be a good thing. But there are going to be plenty of stunts. There'll be the...
I like the stunts. I like the stunts because they're just good entertainment. I think they're bad politics, but they're good entertainment.
Terrible. Now, look, you can remember an old Labor salt on the hustings, Jack, walking into a drinker. Tell me that one.
Oh, yeah, well, Barry, this is many years ago. I was told this story by a union official from, I think, Warrnambool, a meat worker official down there. They had Barry Jones, who at that stage was still famous for being a quiz
very
champion.
Bright man, Barry Jones. Smarter than you and me put together, mate.
Yeah, smarter than everyone. Smarter than everyone, Barry. And anyway, they thought this bloke thought they'd take him into a pub. And the locals would love him.
It's not his natural environment, though, is it?
Because they watch him on the picker box and all that sort of stuff. So everyone's very pleased to see Barry and crowding around him and shaking his hand and all that sort of stuff. And Barry whispers to this bloke, says, "What do I do now?" And the meat worker official says, "You shout around the drinks. I haven't got any money." So you're absolutely right. It was taking Barry well outside of his normal environment.
Yeah, unfair. He preferred to be at a cafe with a book.
Yes, yeah. It'd be like like Bob Carr taking a book to the footy, so I could read a novel, so I could read a novel while the footy was going on.
Yes, he did do that. And look, it wasn't just a paperback either. Bob Carr, it was the big cover tome as well.
Yeah,
history of the Civil War and U.S. American Civil War and all these sorts of things. Yeah,
if it was any bigger, I would have thought Kevin Rudd had written it.
Very good, very good. Look, I did want to talk. We're actually going to call when things go wrong. It's actually the Peter Knott segment of the program, and Peter Knott was the Labor MHR for Gilmore between 1993 and 1996. A great eccentric and much loved within the party. Had a teaching background and so forth. A parliamentarian only briefly, and he won. He won election in 1993 in the Gilmore electorate, which is, the south coast of New South Wales, basically. In the old days, it used to come up a bit into the Highlands, but nowadays it's and has been for a long time around Nowra, Kiama, and going further down Abatements Bay and those sorts of places. And Peter Knott was, as I say, he was a bit of a teacher. We'll tell a few stories from Peter Knott because he was just a classic on the campaign trail. It was absolutely beautiful. It can keep you going for a good 3 or 4 weeks on the Peter Knott segment. But the outstanding one, and people may know this one, is the 1993 election. Jack, you'll remember it was as our first GST election where John Hewson proposed a GST from opposition, and Labor, under Keating in power, decided to knock it off.
What was it called? Fight Back, wasn't it?
Fight Back, yes, but the central policy element was an establishment of a goods and services tax, which gave Labor plenty of ammunition, of course. And there came a great moment in that campaign where Hewson was interviewed on a current affair by Mike Willesee and asked about a birthday cake. And just a little bit of background there. The GST was designed to be, under the Fight Back model, was designed to be universal, a tax on all goods and services. But as they got closer to the election, Hewson had decided to make a few exemptions in goods and services, and this left him a bit open to criticism. But then we moved to the Willesee interview where Hewson was asked, what would the GST be on a birthday cake? And he replied, well, it depends on what's in the cake. And you could just see the election being lost right at that moment because everyone at home just went, what do you mean? What's in the cake? Flour, eggs, butter? Well, it depends what's in the cake. So Labor had him basically on the ropes with his own response there. And in Queensland, Keating had attended a chemist shop where he'd walked around the shop with the pharmacist and all the media in tow, and the chemist would say, well, these Band-Aids, they've got GST on them, but the aspirin doesn't, and all this sort of stuff. And it created this idea of a sort of nightmare around this GST tax on what was taxable and what wasn't. So having had a good day at the chemist shop, Keating decided to have another one. After the birthday cake, decided we'll go to the baker's, and they went to a baker's shop in Bomaderry, which is near Nowra. And Peter Knott, candidate at this stage, Labor candidate for Gilmore, has got to do the arranging. Go and find a bloke who's going to be on our side, who runs a baker shop. So
he's going to be the forward scout.
Go and find him and tee him up.
What do they call him? The advance man. He's going to be the advance man.
Tee him up, make sure he's on our side, and we'll get the media down there, and we'll get Paul to walk around the shop, and he'll say, what's that birthday cake over there? It was a direct play on what had happened. So Peter Knott does as he's told, and he's teed up a baker in Bomaderry, and the Keating entourage arrives, and in marches Paul Keating to the baker shop. I don't think Peter had been all that switched on about getting the right baker on board, because as soon as the baker saw Keating, he started moaning about payroll tax, which is a state tax anyway. And you could see steam coming out of Keating's ears. And within minutes, he just marched off straight back into C1, slammed the door and gone, and Peter Knott was left to left to shield some fairly angry messages from the party organisation. And after that moment, Jack, and this is where we have to be a little bit rude, Peter Knott did in fact win the election, and we'll talk about his behaviour in the campaign in episodes to come. But Peter Knott was known only by Paul Keating in the third person as the cunt from the pie shop, as Labor parliamentarian, Labor parliamentary colleague didn't call him by name, but only called him the cunt from the pie shop. We'll have more on Peter Knott. He's a wonderful man.
I'd call that excellent branding. It's great. It's great name recognition. You know,
you and the cunt from the pie shop. You go and do that. There's some wonderful stories about Peter Knott. He was a great, wonderful eccentric, and I think we need actually a few more less sort of machine type people and a few eccentrics, don't we, in our politics, Jack? Not Bob Catter type eccentrics, not that crazy, but we do need some colourful types. We need a bit of colour in our parliament.
I think we need them in life generally, but yes, particularly in parliament.
Yes, indeed. So more on Peter Knott. There's some fantastic stories there, so we'll continue those all through the campaign. Big issues now, Jack. We don't have a lot of policy up for grabs, so we do have those sort of what we might call personality issues in play here, don't we?
We do, yeah.
So, trust. Who wins trust?
Well,
I can see arguments against on both sides.
Yeah, well, I don't know I kind of expect politicians to tell me a few porkies, to be quite honest. I'm never surprised when they do, you know.
Yeah. It's probably it's worse, I think, when not just when they lie, but when the lie is part of the cover up. I think that's kind of when it gets bad, you know, playing the ukulele and blaming the wife for going to Hawaii, for example. Don't pick up a lot of trust with that.
That just looks stupid.
Why? Again, you know, you and I have been in the caper for a while. You just look at that and say, what are your advisors telling you?
Yeah. Why are you explaining anything?
Put that bloody ukulele down for a start.
Yeah.
And if you make another curry, I'll tell you what you'll wear. But when you're running a small target, as Albo is, how do you get that sort of perceptions of competence across? It's not easy, is it? You know, how can you be the one to trust, at least in terms of your ability to lead a competent government and be competent yourself when you're running this small target strategy?
I don't think most voters expect the government to get everything right. So, like, say on the COVID situation, I can't think of a government anywhere around the world who's got everything right. The best you can hope for is you get, you know, kind of most of the big issues right most of the time. That's about as well as you can go, you know, and that's what I think people are looking for in a government. They're not looking for perfection. They've got a better understanding of human nature than that. What they're looking for is sort of basically get the ducks in a row, you know, and anything more than that is a bonus.
Yeah. So look, do people have too great an expectation of government?
I think sometimes they do. I think sometimes they do. And we talked about the budget the other week and how it's turned into a cargo cult, you know, where the way the media covers that sort of stuff is they're looking to ensure that no single Australian is worse off from government activities. And that's just not how government works. Whatever you do is going to annoy somebody. You know?
It can't be. You'd never reform it. I mean, look, we've had probably a good 10, 12 years where reform just is a dirty word, but you can't reform things if you got this sense of can the minister now tell me that no Australian will be worse or would be worse off under his policy. I mean, that's that's the sort of crazy stuff that we've got. That's a really soft opposition attack for a start. But this idea that you can't affect change, that overall is beneficial, that overall will drive economic growth or create better environments or create better outcomes in education. You can't have change in those areas because one person may be put out by it.
No, it's just no way to go about it. And I don't think people, I think that's what the media coverage expects, but I don't think it's what voters expect.
Yeah, all right. Okay, so we're going to go through issues as we go. This week, the major issues with voters. This week, we're looking at climate change. And I guess the first question is, Jack, is it a big issue in this election?
Well, I went to your pal Barry Cassidy's Twitter feed the other week, and he had this to say about the Morrison government. Tone-deaf government. Is it any wonder they face serious challenges from independents in previously safe seats? This is the election when climate change finally arrives as an issue and they don't see it. Now, the thing that I enjoyed about that was that you sort of got the impression that Barry's been saying that climate change is going to be the issue in every election for about the last 5, but it hasn't quite made it. But this time it's going to make it,
2007, you couldn't call it a climate change election because they were Me Tooing.
Yes, they were.
2010, certainly not an election issue at that time, but it arose in 2013, but in a different way because Gillard was punished and Labor were punished for the carbon tax, the tax that we were not going to have. Then we go to 2016. I just can't see. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't a voting determinant, but it wasn't in some cases. So we're, in the wrap up after an election, good polling companies and good market research companies will go through and say, well, why did you decide to vote the way you did? Didn't matter which way you voted, but why did you do it? And that could be the economy, employment, cost of living, housing, interest rates. It can be a whole lot of things. And somewhere along that line, there'll be climate change. But I don't see climate change in the last, say, 5 or 6 elections fitting in that top 3.
Well, if you restricted your information input to the major media outlets and Twitter, you would think that climate change is a huge determinant. But I actually think it's been a losing election issue. Sorry, pro climate activism has been a losing election issue much more than it's been a winning one.
Look, there is the argument about 2019 and the former Green leader Bob Brown and his his convoy into Queensland, and Labor afterwards conceded that it was just a disaster. It was not something they had any control over, but it was an absolute disaster because it pointed out to the punters that Bill was having 5 bob each way on climate and mining development in Queensland. And
that's because if you ask people, do they think we should do something about climate change? Do we think we should be jumping on the climate activist bandwagon? They'll say yes. Of course we will, and they'll keep saying that until you say it's going to cost you money, and then they say, "Well, I'm not quite so sure about that."
Well, yeah, possibly. I mean, it depends. I mean, so I think the answer, in short, is it's going to be a voting determinant in places like and in places like Goldstein, in places like Higgins, in places like North Sydney and Wentworth, in places like these blue ribbon seats, because there is a perception among what we might call centrist liberal voters that this government has done not enough. So this is why we do have the Climate 200 independents. Now,
these are the well-off liberal centrist voters who can afford for it to cost them some money.
You've got to be worth 3 or 4 million just to think about living there,
Yeah, so, but in the seats where elections are normally determined, this sort of activity is nowhere near as popular because these are people, for whom it is going to hurt, and who can't afford just to say, "Oh well, I'll buy an electric vehicle."
Well, what we saw in 2019 was a massive swing in Hunter, which was held by Joel Smacker Fitzgibbon, Fitzpatrick, and like I say, 14 to 15% swing against him in a very safe Labor seat. He ended up holding the seat, of course, but gee, you got the feeling that Smacker looked around after that election and thought, gee whiz, there's actually working class people in my seat. I had no idea. Mining. I had no idea what was going on here. You never see any of them on the golf course. That's the thing, Because anyway, I'm a bit of a critic of him because he came to this realisation very late, Jack. He came to this realisation that Labor was perhaps letting down its coal miners, and really coal miners are, historically the lifeblood of the party. And he just made a view to say, oh well, look, we can't be winning seats in the inner city and winning seats in the Hunter. But we flipped that with the coalition because they are now running the risk of losing 2 or 3 blue ribbon seats that potentially they won't get back for 3 or 4 elections. And that's going to be a real hard thing for them to do. If they're able to hold the seats they've got, lose 2, 3, 4 to Labor from that sort of marginal seat range, but then drop, say, and I'm told the polling, it's early days before an election was called, but I'm told the polling in McKellar is very, very bad for Joseph Felinsky, very, very bad for Joel Frydenberg, and looking a bit dodgy in Goldstein, where Zoe Daniel is the independent there. It looks like Zali Stegel on that polling, early polling, will hold Warringah, and so they might lose, say, 3 or 4. And they'll never get them back. Well, they'll get them back, but not for a very long time. So that will make their ability to fight future elections really, really difficult, hand behind the back. And that is essentially on climate change, I would think, and perhaps more broadly a perception that Morrison is not their most loved politician.
I don't think you can win the election in the inner suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne.
You can't. But what I'm saying is, you
have to risk those seats. Is the answer in my view?
Yeah. Well, they're certainly fighting. Because if I'm aware of the polling, they'd be aware of it too. It's showing Frydenberg behind. It's showing Felinsky behind in McKellar. No one's even talked about McKellar, and that's old Bronny's seat. And if you lose those, it's kind of they're out of the blue type seats. So you can run around in marginals and do what you like and hope like hell that those swing seats fall your way or enough of them. But if you're losing 3 or 4 from the other end, it's disastrous. So I think the answer is, and you may not agree, the answer is that climate change is going to have an impact on this election, but from those areas that the Liberal Party had perhaps taken for granted.
Yeah, I still think the election will be, by and large, one where it generally is in the outer suburbs of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and in the regional areas. And in those areas, I don't think climate activism or big changes forward to try and prevent climate change are going to be a winning issue. I mean, if you're watching Twitter or the ABC, you would think that if only we'd voted for Bill Shorten 3 years ago, there would have been no bushfires and there'd be no floods. That a vote for Bill Shorten would have prevented all of those things, and I don't think people believe anything like that.
I went looking for some polling on this, Jack, and there's not a lot around. There's not a lot around.
No.
There's voting determination stuff back from 2019, but this was a poll conducted by Essential on March the 22nd, and it came in the wake of floods in Queensland and New South Wales. And it said the first question was, given climate change is happening, the government needs to do more to prepare for extreme weather events. 39% strongly agree, 26% somewhat agree, 65 agree, basically. So if there isn't, it's next question, if there isn't significant action on climate soon, we can expect flooding in Australia to be even worse in the future. 35 strongly agree, 22 somewhat agree. If we're serious about reducing the future impact of floods, Australia needs to replace coal with renewable energy as soon as possible. 29 and 24 in that strongly agree, somewhat agree, 53 or up. And finally, the government has contributed to the extent of recent flooding in Queensland and New South Wales by not doing enough about it. And there we have 23 and 23, 46 strongly agree or somewhat agree. Look, first thing I'd say about that is we don't know where those polls were undertaken. I looked at the methodology, but it didn't show any sort of accurate or disclose where those questions were put and what electorates, I should say. And also you would say you're asking these questions when the effects of floods in this case are fairly raw on people, and they're prepared to perhaps answer in ways that they might not answer a month or two later. And that's not calling people vacuous, but it's just that it's raw in their minds and constant sort of media coverage. But that's the closest thing I could find to this having some sort of determination on the current election. As I say, I think it will have an impact. I think it'll have an impact in Hunter and Shortland. I certainly think it does. And Albanese's going to have to ask some questions. It's going to have an impact on how they get on in some Queensland seats, which are probably too far away for them to win now. We're talking about Labor. But it's certainly going to – are they going to be able to hang on to Hunter? Because Hunter's now a marginal seat. Shortland's now a marginal seat.
I actually think the Labor Party position on climate change has cost them the last two elections.
Okay. All right. Well, we will see as we go through.
And it may well cost them this one as well.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Look, if you were going to look for a strong factor, we'll look at all these as we go. If we're going to look at a strong factor, CPI seems to be the focus. Certainly it's a Labor focus. Cost of living. And there are major pressures on Australians at the moment. Maybe they'll feel a little bit more favourably about the government because the juice is 20 cents cheaper post-budget than it was, well, before the budget. It was hitting up around $2, which is kind of bloody expensive if you're a commuter, if you're a car commuter in Sydney or Melbourne, any of the major capital cities. That's a big, if you're buying two tanks a week, mate, that's a lot a day.
Well, I think I'll only go back to Australia if I get my government petrol card back.
Well, yeah, it's nice if someone else pays for it. Put it that way. Yeah, look, and it is a major issue now. But now we're seeing juice down to about $1.80, and was tipping over. I saw just before the budget people queuing out of the service station in my neck of the woods. 5-6 cars back because the juice was below $2, $1.97 a litre, and so yeah, people are constantly aware of this, particularly in the regions where you do a lot of driving. So cost of living would seem to be a major issue for most of Australia, and I think
it's going to be interesting, isn't it? Though these inflation and cost of living issues are worldwide. And there is very little, if anything, that an Australian government can do about it. And will that carry over into our election? I just don't know.
Well, I mean,
it's an unusual situation.
Be convinced by the argument, it's sort of standard. Taxes will always be lower under a Liberal government. Interest rates will always be lower. You won't hear that one. By the way, interest rates will always be lower under a Liberal government. You won't hear that one because we're going to have an interest rate rise on top of CPI living, regardless of who's in government, by the ways. Most of the banks predict it will happen about September. So we'll have an interest rate rise, which means basically you'll start getting a little bit more money for your money. But if you want to borrow money, it's still bloody cheap. I guess we get back to that role of government type issue where, how much can fiscal policy drive things like CPI? I mean, yes, we can reduce tariffs on juice and reduce tinker with a little bit of. We might even tinker with the GST to get it down, but it's all sort of nonsense, isn't it? Because you are just tinkering at what are essentially sort of global issues, and we've talked in our other podcast about there's going to be a shortage of food around the world coming.
Yes, indeed.
In the next year or two. In fact, in the coming months. So people will have these pressures regardless of who's in power. But I guess what it comes down to is the credibility of those who say it'll be cheaper, it'll be more affordable, you'll be better looked after under us.
Yeah. I think the honest answer is to say we think we'll manage it better.
Yeah.
But the problem is there. We can't make it go away. But the honest approach is to say, I think we can manage it better.
I think that is the best response. Otherwise, you've got this idea that, governments, you do get into that governments can solve all your problems type area, and you're creating, but the potential for a sort of lot of backlash from politics if you promise the world and you can't deliver. So shall we wrap up?
That was true of COVID. When the worst thing you could say about COVID is that we can cure it or we can make it go away, we'll get rid of it. Whereas the right approach was to say we can manage the problem better than the other lot can.
All right. Now we're going to wrap up this first show. I'm going to put the acid right on you. Give me a result. Now, bear in mind, you can change it next week. You can change it all the way. If you're in the punditry business, you've got to have a bit of laxity. I'm a pundit by nature. Oh, Jesus, I'm timid after 2019. But tell me who's going to win and why.
Oh, look, this could be hard with the head. I've never voted Liberal in my life, so I'm kind of hoping that Labor will get up. Probably a little bit more so than last time, because I've never been a Bill Shorten fan.
You're an old SL man, He's not going to love him.
He was in the wrong faction, but so at the moment I would expect Labor to win, but unlike the pundits in the last election, I'm not sure that that's going to happen, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if it doesn't happen. I'd just be, he didn't win, But at the moment, I expect him to win, but it's a long way away.
It is a long way away, and you can change. The best thing about being a pundit is you can change, and even if you're proven wrong, you can just be really silent about it afterwards.
You just forget it happened.
Just forget that it happened.
Just look at your pals on the Insiders program. They've all forgotten that they were all wrong.
Mate, it's not about being right. It's about being certain that your opinion is good enough. Now, look, look, just for what it's worth, I think.
So who do you think? Come on.
At this stage, I'm prepared to change, and I'll give you a bit of an inkling on the Godin trials I go through. But I say Labor with a majority of 5 in the new Parliament. So close enough. I think we'll get a couple of the Indies up in those blue ribbon seats. I think two at this stage. Might not happen at all, but I'm going to say 2 at this stage. The Godin trail reading that I do is individual seat betting, and that'll take a little while to roll out, firstly, and then to get some sort of idea of trend. And so what we do there, or what I do there, is look at a band of marginal seats both held by the Labor and the Coalition, and look at the betting and look at the trends. And what we saw in 2019 with this, which is why I was quite pessimistic about a shortened election, was that Shorten winning the election, was that a lot of those Queensland marginals, Labor had lost favouritism 2 weeks before the poll, but by the time the poll was called, the coalition were in very healthy levels of favouritism in those seats. So that's the stuff I tend to look at when we're turning for a result. It's not perfect. It's not papal, but it's the one I use. So we're at this stage. I'm going to say Labor by 5.
Well, we'll see.
We shall see, and we will be
time to get
back.
your bets on.
Yes, we will be back. We will be back with hard hats and Hi-Viz in a week's time, and we'll give you the updates as we go on. Good to see you, Jack. Well done, mate.
Cheers.
See you, mate.